You know, viewer, as someone who can remember back to the period of time when they were called Capcom by their pissed off fans back in 2013, it is all the more remarkable that the publisher of this game has been able to turn themselves around and make a concerted effort to be at least a positive force in the industry, kind of like Nintendo when they're not doing mobile game crap. Not everything that Capcom has done since has been perfect, but at the very least, they aren't actively trying to steal and cajole their paying customers like some of the other big players, and at least right now, they aren't embroiled in a very stupid and obvious controversy built over years and years of them just fucking around. Cough, cough. And even more so with one of their, 4 golden geese, being able to bring Resident Evil back from the brink of its dipshit period with Resident Evil 6, Operation Raccoon City, and fucking Umbrella Corps? While not entirely perfect, Biohazard was a breath of fresh air, a new force for the series, for this ex-dilapidated quote-unquote horror series, for taking a AAA whack of the bat at the previously indie-style first-person horror idea and spinning it with this new character, new premise, and has the familiar trappings of the Resident Evil series. You know, the shit that used to make the series a fun time, like ridiculous puzzles and grotesquely designed creatures that want to beat your face in. VIII was going to be an important step for Capcom to make with the Resident Evil series, since with only one game under their belt post 6's staying on the series, we honestly didn't really know which direction this was going to take quality-wise. This might be a new step forward, or this might be a Witcher 3 scenario where they're coasting on one good game and then the next one they just fall off a cliff. Obviously, Devil May Cry 5 made a pretty good case that Capcom was probably not going to fuck this up, but you never really know. So I guess we better do what we do and take a look at the game for ourselves. Like a whole bunch of Resident Evil plots and stories and lore, VIII starts off with a pretty amusing and badly written intro that served to be a simple bullet list of changes between Biohazard and VIII. Ethan returns home with the canonical survival of his girlfriend from Biohazard, so this is definitely the point where Capcom issued an official middle finger to anyone who left her behind in the other timeline. They managed to work through their obvious trauma that the Baker encounter did to them and its lingering effects to the point that they've been moved out to rural European country in a lovely cottage provided for them by the organization that discovered Ethan post-encounter. It's been several years, and the pair now have a beautiful baby girl to look over, but there are definitely some cracks in the relationship as Ethan slightly scolds his wife for reading a frankly terrifying bedtime story to their baby. Ethan dotes on her quite a bit, and I'm sure that this will be built on later in the world building. Right now, you have to do the first-person game thing of overly complicated button presses to do simple tasks, as Ethan navigates his entire house to find where the crib is and puts Rose to sleep, as he comes back to talk with his wife about the recent problems they've been having. They've set up a nice meal to have together at 9 p.m. or 1 in the morning, I can't really tell, and it's just the life of new parents. And as they begin to address the relationship issues, Ethan's wife gets capped in the motherfucking head and he ducks under the table under the hail of gunfire. This all happens in the space of 5 minutes, and this is going to be the kind of game we have to look forward to as the murderers kick the door in and Ethan gets kidnapped by none other than goddamn Chris Redfield, looking like he's in his 50s now. Maybe late 40s. It looks like he's turned sides again, and his agents knock Ethan out cold and kidnap Rose to the boot. The pair are then slammed into the unit's van and drive away about 12 miles from their house before the driver gets caught in an allegedly random accident, leaving his escorts dead in the snow, and Ethan left to go after his missing daughter alone. Thus begins the rigmarole of Resident Evil 8. If anything else can be said for this game, VIII keeps up a remarkably tight pace throughout its runtime, with areas and encounters running from place to place with very little wasted energy or time. Everything just feels full to the brim with stuff going on. And while the story is obviously ridiculous, it all runs together believably since it escalates so naturally from place to place. At one point, you're learning about the actual fate of the village, you're meeting the people who did that, the fate of Rose, and eventually the mission of whatever the hell Redfield was up to throughout a series of oddball, absurd, but satisfying terror traps orchestrated by the ultimate villain and her cronies. Shortly after Ethan arrives in town, he begins to realize that everything got predictably fucked before he even got there, as almost the entire village has been vacated and left behind a lot of locked doors and single cases of bullets. Bumbling his way through the villagers' homes and stuff until he gathers his bearings, he finally runs into the first person there. There are surprisingly survivors of the extinction event that Ethan helps to get to shelter so that he can start having some idea of what's actually happening. Ethan meets a few survivors who are pretty on edge and camping out with a respected town leader in the local church. This quaint moment lasts a grand old 5 seconds before whatever the hell happened comes crashing directly on top of Ethan. It causes a fire and kills all of the village survivors, along with the one last person Ethan isn't able to save due to incompetence from everybody involved. Yeah, apparently this town was completely obliterated by a horde of the weirdest werewolves. All I can really tell right now is that it's a lot of deranged furry people wielding anything they can get their hands on, which is why a lot of them resort to simply punching and slapping Ethan upside the head. After getting into a few scrapes and shootouts with the beasts, you can begin to get an inkling that Village is beginning to remind you of some other games you played before. This begins falling into place when the combination of Ethan needing some actual answers and his constant run-in with the furry gang and their enforcers runs him down a path that he needed to find Rose. A scraggly old witch with her cryptic clues accidentally gives him something to go on, and he walks out of the village to get some more elaborate meeting grounds. Of course, being a bumbler with no idea of what he's doing, Ethan didn't really see it coming when he got domed on the noggin and dragged to the first major cutscene, the meeting of the Lords. This is where we get to meet the perpetrators of whatever the fuck happened. Salvatore, the short straw drawer who got transmogrified into a horrifying Deep One looking guy. Beneviento, a 1-foot-tall puppet thing. Heisenberg, the most fantastically voice-acted character next to Leon Kennedy with Magneto powers and a clear sign that a couple of people at Capcom are huge Breaking Bad fans. And the completely obvious and standout Lady Dimitrescu, the woman who single-handedly sold this game, whose only outward ability from the start is that she's like 9 feet tall. And finally, the woman of the hour, Mother Miranda, this game's Sadler stand-in. This scene shows that Capcom decided to sit down and try to spin out their Ethan character into another grand attempt to capture the Resident Evil 4 lightning in a bottle. It's pretty clear from how the game lays itself out. Vague rural European setting, trying to rescue lost girl, the village collection mechanics and maps, the series of absurd antagonists working together, a series of radically different levels that are somehow part of the same game, some quirky ass boss fights, and the classic stupidly elaborate but incredibly simple puzzles, and also Salvatore's entire boss fight and area is a pretty big clue that this was Capcom's crack of the bat to make Resident Evil 4 Part 2. Except that they already tried to do that with Resident Evil 5, so I guess this is Part 3? The problem with trying to do this is that Resident Evil 4's development was such an incredibly specific series of events and decisions that nothing else is really going to recapture that magic. This is what I'd hoped Capcom learned when they sort of tried to do the same thing with that other game I mentioned, and it clearly didn't work out because they also tried to shove Resident Evil 5 full of timeline plot points that RE4 deliberately didn't have. Resident Evil 4 was defined by its strategic action combat and the B-movie energy that the game's plot had throughout the entire showcase. And the very fact that Village is trying to do the same premise, but take it seriously, already guarantees that it's not going to hit the same mark. Resident Evil 4 was completely silly and batshit, knew it, and just went with whatever absurdity they could throw into the game. And Village has absurd plot points, but wants the situation to be tense and very serious. Now, that's definitely not to say that Village doesn't hold its own without its big brother, but the idea that the quote-unquote inspiration is so blatant, it needs to be a part of the review since it's such a big part of the game itself. Village is definitely not a lesser project leeching onto one of the gaming's top 10 best games, and it does come to the table with its own ideas, and ultimately it has its own story to tell. Ethan's quest in Village is very upfront and very simple. He wants to save Rose no matter the cost, or the hardship, or the consequences, and in the meeting which he escapes in a little bit, it's also equally clear that he'll need to mount all of the Lord's heads on a wall to get her back, which leads our faceless protagonist onto a vengeance-fueled odyssey of each of the Lord's hiding places / castles. After escaping Heisenberg's death trap so we can get a feel for his entire deal, while also dying 6 times to his Thresher of Death, or maybe that was just me, we can finally get moving to saving our daughter. The first one on the chopping block that will need to be made bigger is Dimitrescu. Dimitrescu's castle is the first time we get to see what Village is trying to do as a game. The opening area and the intro gave us an inkling, but Dimitrescu's castle is the game's pitch meeting. Likewise, since this is the character the game was entirely hyped around, this is also one of the 2 long levels in the game, kinda like Salazar's castle if you could believe that! It involves quite a bit, room by room exploration in order to try to find MacGuffins to shove into puzzle locks, a couple odd locks that need to be opened by reading diary entries, a lot of the Biohazard gunplay that we'd gotten accustomed to by that point, and a few puzzle boss fights involving the Dimitrescu sisters, her daughters that want to eat Ethan because everyone in this game is fucking mental. The death traps are actually well thought out, and while Dimitrescu's castle runs over itself as backtracking in it and takes quite a long time to see everything that it's got and shoot all of it in the face, it's well paced as hell to keep you consistently interested in turning the next corner like Salazar's castle, like the Spencer mansion. This level's always got new stuff to see, new places to go, so the name of the game here throughout all this nonsense is to locate 4 angelic masks in order to unlock the final battle with Dimitrescu, and through that you'll be sneaking around the sisters, gathering new guns, and plenty of resources to deal with their old servants themselves, and even sneaking around Dimitrescu herself to get what you need. And the battle with the Lord is appropriately over the top, where obviously the sexy hype character was going to transmogrify into a horrible beast. Kinda like Excella, if you could remember that. So, in the end, she turns into a Quelaag knockoff, except this time it's a gargoyle. Frankly, it's a well-designed creature, but the fight itself is kind of meh. Probably because it was the game's first go with their bosses, so it ends up kind of being monotonous, dumb, and slow. Only really making something happen when she's basically already dead. Ironic for the face of the game, Dimitrescu herself barely had a personality other than being big and angry and obviously motherly. No, not for that reason. The one time she had to show her uniqueness was actually in a diary entry when she ended the book by saying she needed a cigarette, which is such a classic goof that I can barely give her points for even that. At least when we move on to the others, there's a bit more meat on the bone. Beneviento was up next for me, and this change in scenery highlights that the setup for this game was Capcom's real excuse to essentially just smash together 4 different horror games and call it a day. Again, like Resident Evil 4, each locale that you go to manages to be completely different with separate mechanics, core concepts, gameplay sections, enemies, bosses, and set pieces, while also still feeling like we're in the same overall area, since the levels are built so well into the world and their important characters are tied to each other in a believable manner. The 4 lords are so starkly different from each other in personality and motive that it bleeds into their castles in the same tune, which allows Capcom this level of creative freedom that a lot of other games don't give themselves. Beneviento's level is a lot shorter than Dimitrescu's, since I think Capcom thought that the boss would be more boring than her, but I have to give them a lot of credit since for the most part, Beneviento's mansion is a combat-free zone, which is a remarkable thing that they managed to accomplish even for a level that'll only really take you 2-ish hours to finish up. It's going for more of the older generation of first-person horror game, where you're required to run away from enemies and sneak around them to grab puzzle items rather than having any real ability to defend yourselves from them. It's all about fixing up a mannequin in the basement so that you can get access to fuses to fix the elevator back up to the boss, and it manages to be the slow, contemplative, and more in-your-face scary than Dimitrescu's castle, and I can really respect that change in pace, since it flows so smoothly from one level to the next that it just shows that they know exactly what they're doing and it fits super smooth into the game. No bumps on the road. This is fantastic. On the other hand, the boss fight again is kinda dumb since it's just a hide-and-seek minigame that has a low margin for error, but I guess what else could you do with a puppet boss? I don't know, lean into the puppetry and make us fight a bunch of dolls, give us our guns back so that we can shoot something. But, maybe that's a bit unfair for a level that wanted to be combat-free. I don't know, it just seems like kind of a letdown, really, for something that could have had such a brilliant, unique concept for a boss fight. And speaking of such, the dearth of this game is clearly Salvatore, a bumbling fool and blind servant to Miranda motivated entirely by proving himself in spite of his clear incompetence at everything. His level is going to be more puzzle-centric and death-dodging, since the entire dam and windmill level is essentially a giant reminder that Capcom knows that the fans love the Del Lago boss fight from Resident Evil 4, so they built an entire level around navigating flooded waterways and avoiding becoming fish food. Due to Salvatore being so bad at his frickin' job, Ethan actually managed to grab his part of Rose a long-ass time ago. This entire rigmarole has been Ethan simply trying to leave, which is kinda hard in a flooded area where your pursuer lives in the waves. After draining some parts of the village, Ethan bumbles his way into the face-off of him and the Fishman, and while it's not the worst boss in the world, it's still kind of an annoying boss fight revolving around setting traps and looking around corners to find Salvatore, all the while dodging his terrible hitbox attack and acid rain. A lot of running around for resources and landmines and keeping an eye on the Fishman will be required, but if you keep yourself together for a few minutes, you'll actually be perfectly fine to dynamite his goo pile and finally head back to the central village. And now, the last person to settle up with is Heisenberg, who is my personal favorite of the five. Maybe if Dimitrescu had an actual personality, it would have been her, but god damn it, Heisenberg is full to the brim with it, and clearly his voice actor was having an incredibly fun time. Due to his magnetoing stunts, obviously Heisenberg constructed himself a massive metal plant as his base of operations. It's simple enough to get to, and then things just kind of start generally falling apart once he's there. The first thing that happens is actually a bit weird. Heisenberg jumps into the scene and immediately ambushes Ethan not to kill him, but ask him to help out. Heisenberg is tired with his whole Lords system and wants to take down Miranda himself, but the big wrench in the middle of this is that he needs Rose to defeat Miranda, meaning that Ethan needs to relinquish all three of the parts he's got to Heisenberg's one. I mean, it's Heisenberg, so this is obviously super shifty, and so Ethan refuses to join, and for all of his trouble, Heisenberg just throws him to his very loud dog to be sliced apart later. This begins a true factory odyssey for Ethan in trying to get out of this huge complex. Heisenberg's factory is late in the game, and therefore it's really combat heavy. If I could remember, I'd say that it's pretty reminiscent of the military island of Resident Evil 4, where Ethan needs to run around and gun down Heisenberg's experiments with monster cyborgs in order to get access to key molds, and unlock the next few floors he has to get to up to escape. It's honestly about the same length as Dimitrescu's castle, so there's a lot to see and a lot to gun down, but this is definitely getting to the point where if you don't know the game, you're gonna have a bad time here. We get to learn a little bit more about Heisenberg and his brewing betrayal, along with a couple death traps and his concept for the monster cyborg made to serve him and him alone. If you manage to keep yourself conscious through 4 floors of this factory tour, Ethan finally comes face to, fan of that loud guy from earlier in the level. Instead of it being a cleverly designed robot man cyborg thing, it seems like Heisenberg gave up on this design and simply strapped a giant engine to the torso of a lycanthrope and called it a day. I mean, at one point it did have arms, but it was stupid enough to chop them off himself with that cutter blade on the front of its face. This is your classic showdown where the enemy is blind and simply charges everywhere hoping to hit you, and then you just shoot it in the back. Nice and simple. It does, however, start gaining fire powers after the engine starts overloading, but you're in a metal factory, just stand behind a giant engine and you'll be fine. Now, we don't have Heisenberg's part of Rose yet. Actually, we haven't seen the glasses goof in ages, so what's going on? Where the hell is he? Well, what's going on is Heisenberg thinking around you like a champ and dropping your ass in a hole never to be seen again. Well, for like 3 minutes in the meantime, you get to see Chris again, having already infiltrated and figured out what Heisenberg is doing. To give this level some legs, I guess, this is also the point where Ethan finally runs into Chris Redfield again in between getting the generators running. It's here that we finally get some goddamned answers about how Chris actually isn't the bad guy. Apparently the person he shot to bits was a Mia clone, and the plan that he stopped was around kidnapping Rose for her latent abilities. Ethan wasn't told about this due to protecting him from the dark secret, but now they don't have any time to worry about his feelings. The pair consider joining up together in order to take down Miranda, and then they separate to go on separate missions. Well, at least Redfield hasn't become a corrupt piece of shit, just a bad planner. The pair do have a plan to get back at the metal lummox, and it turns out too, like Resident Evil 3, be another abandoned experimental weapon that's still functional. Chris switches it on and then hands the tank over to Ethan to use against him, and yes, even though this is the first person period of Resident Evil, we still get a vehicle section. It's time for the tank battle! When this thing drives itself up to the surface and meets Heisenberg properly, it turns out to be a real heavy mech dust-up between Ethan's tank and the full force of Heisenberg's Magneto-ness, where he grafts a bunch of scrap iron to himself and creates a death robot out of himself, which leads to a fun, fast-paced section of hot lead and getting punched in the chops. This is definitely the best by a country mile, a vehicle section that is just lots of dumb fun where you don't need to worry about resources or keeping yourself alive all that much. All you really need to do is focus your crosshairs and have a fun time ducking behind cover and outrunning fists or getting shot. Naturally, Heisenberg has tons of health and it means multiple phases to the clash, so it lasts just long enough as it needs to, and it's simply golden standard difficulty. This is something that Village really could have used. Just a bit of dumb embracing of the action game idea and making something loud and epic happen on screen. After getting the last few shots in, Heisenberg goes down and leaves us alone with our final target. Well, I say that, but she does it even faster than I thought would be the case. Yeah, Miranda just shows up out of nowhere almost immediately after Heisenberg is defeated. Yep, it's the classic villain ploy, allow the protagonist to gather up all the MacGuffins only to swoop in and kick them in the dick so that you can have them all to yourself just to free up your busy schedule. Except in this case, rather than being unconscientified, Miranda just straight up murders Ethan. Well, that didn't take long. I guess the whole vengeance thing didn't work out so well. So what now, smart game? Well, who's left in this situation to play as? Yep, it's the Chris part of the game now. The game fast forwards to the next night since Chris escaped the factory to move on to the next part of the plan, along with Miranda just giving up and extending her power's influence over the entire village herself. So now Chris has to sort things out, and kinda like the tank section, this is just more dumb action sections strung together just so the game can have a laugh with it. Chris gets equipped with the best armor and guns that are 3 times better than Ethan's on their best day and hundreds of bullets, so yeah, it's just kill everything all the time with your loud guns and destroy the village with the next few minutes of time. The name of the game in this level is take Chris to the center of the village and nuke Miranda's treehouse, which gets kinda hard to do since literal mobs of werewolves start showing up to clobber Chris's face. I mean, you have so much health that their attacks don't really matter in the grand scheme of things, but it's still really annoying to constantly deal with this. Follow that up with a battle against another one of the Warhammer werewolves that doesn't last too long because Stinger missiles are in the equation, and that's essentially the whole section. Chris gets into Miranda's lab proper, and Capcom decides to use an anti-aging plot element of the mold from Biohazard as a dumb connection to have this game tie into the prologue of the Raccoon City incident for whatever fucking reason, and Chris, after reading all that nonsense, manages to rescue a locked up Mia? Yeah, Miranda kept Mia alive down here to work on her immortal vessel experiment. Chris has the unfortunate duty to tell Mia of Ethan's demise and that they need to get the hell out of there since Miranda's destroying everything she can get her hands on, but Mia looks at him confused since Ethan actually isn't as useless as everyone thought he was. Well, he kind of was. The rub is that Ethan isn't really Ethan. Ethan died way back when he first got into the Baker house in Biohazard, and he's been living his life as a moldy corpse for everything up until now, which means that Ethan couldn't have been killed by Miranda because he was never alive. Never mind how Rose came to be, we're Capcom and we're just making a goofy story here. So after an introspective mind trip, Ethan brings himself back to undeath just in time to face Miranda properly. I really can't blame Miranda for this screw-up. She doesn't really need any guns, and Ethan was dead already, so why would she strip the body and leave him weaponless? But because of that little oversight, Ethan can simply go to her experimental altar and go to the final boss battle since there's really no level to speak of for Miranda. You can just go there because she left it unlocked. Miranda's battle is actually pretty difficult. Not incredibly bad, but it's another irritating fight due to how she attacks in a first-person game, which simply doesn't give you enough information to know where to be when she does certain attacks, along with needing to shoot multiple targets in a few seconds to avoid certain attacks like her giant orbs of doom. Capcom took some steps to mitigate this, such as slowing her attack pattern down and making her targeting more obvious than it needed to be, but this is still a first-person game, and without dialing the difficulty down to completely insulting, there wasn't much they could do to have this worth of multi-phase, large repertoire showdown without there being really glaring issues with the gameplay. It just doesn't work like it should in first person, whereas every other boss fight understood that limitation and built themselves around it. It's just kind of weird that the final encounter, the real showstopper, didn't, and due to the lack of build-up with Miranda herself, ultimately it felt like a letdown again, almost exactly like Sadler's demise in RE4. However, in a different sort of move, rather than doing an escape, the game just ends almost exactly like Biohazard and smashed cuts to the credits after the final battle. That's just due to the battle itself and a creative decision from Capcom. Ethan got pretty screwed up after that climactic showdown, as right now he's on death's door. However, the masterless mold is still in the village and poised to corrupt the landscape or something, and someone has to stay behind with the detonator that Chris planted earlier. Ethan grabs it and smashed the button while still being in the village, managing to do something with his final moments and leaving behind the unkidnapped Rose in the arms of a mourning Mia, and for some reason, an emotional Chris. The game then gives us a brief flash forward where it previews that Resident Evil will obviously continue on with a 9, with their new pro tag being none other than Rose herself. Yeah, for some reason, this series that is obsessed with its own timeline is fine with just pushing the boat out with nothing happening for 20 years as she's officially kidnapped by some organization that she now works for since they can't let those super duper powers out of anyone's sight. And hey, like Leon Kennedy, might as well use her skills in the meantime for some of our own jobs. I mean, it's a better idea than all those other long-running series jumping into endless prologue games that end up making the timeline completely nonsensical, but I'm sure that Capcom's gonna retreat on that and, fill out the 20-year gap with some sort of games. I mean, it's just honestly a good business decision. And that was Village, everything that it had, and from everything we've seen, this is definitely going to not only be the new direction of the games, but also a damned good one. Proving that they know what they're doing, Village, in spite of being an obvious attempt to replicate the unreplicatable success of Resident Evil 4, is a vibrant, well-paced horror action jaunt through a variety of different scenarios and starkly different levels helmed by 4 dynamic antagonists that each have something different to show for themselves. With a nice mix of action set pieces and ridiculous puzzles, Village really has everything that a Resident Evil fan is looking for, and is going to be good enough to rope in some non-fans as well with the bland nature of Ethan's backstory, meaning that you don't actually need to know much about the Baker family incident to understand what's going on in this game, since a lot of the important points being brought into Village from that game are also explained within this game. It's a brilliant addition to the series, bringing a mix of past elements mixed in well together that provides a cohesive and brilliant action first-person game for anyone who still wants to get some use out of their PS4. It's not the most perfect game ever made, yet still manages to be another slam dunk for Capcom without all the stupid business BS that they can sometimes bring into their games. Capcom just made and sold a video game. Who would have thunk?